Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. It's my distinct pleasure to be with you one more time as we discuss a very important topical matter. Well, I'm not sure what just happened. I was in perhaps the middle of um, my video when something happened and I have to re-record it. So I hope that I remember what I said before, right? Sometimes these things happen, right? And you have to redo what you have just done. Now, we are living in some very interesting times, and I made a video yesterday about, is Donald Trump the major threat? Day before yesterday, rather, is Donald Trump the major threat or the existential threat to Western democracy? Now, they're saying that that he's the greatest threat, that he's a dangerous man, and he represents the greatest threat to Western democracy. We also heard last year, and perhaps this year too, that his MAGA people also represent the greatest threat to Western democracy. Now, we're going to look at some of the points here that Edward Luce in his book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, is saying. And he, looking at these points from in the chapter part 1, Fusion, and we are going to be looking at what some of the problems that he has highlighted that Western societies are experiencing. He has opened the chapter with a quotation from Alexis Tocqueville. And for those of you who know Alexis Tocqueville, he was the one a French guy who went to America and expressed his impression and the fact that he was highly captivated and impressed with America's system of democracy, as far as the Constitution and, the whole free-spirited nature of Americans when he went there sometimes in the 19th century. He says here, the most imperious, that's his Tocqueville speaking, the most imperious of all necessities, that of not sinking in the world, right? So we don't want the world to sink, right? We want the world to remain afloat. Now, in 2017, as Edward Luce opens his book with, the global economy changed guard. So we saw where Donald Trump came to office in 2017. The venue was Davos, the annual gathering of the world's wealthiest recyclers of conventional wisdom, and consistently one of the last places to anticipate what is going to happen next, right? The thing about these people in Davos, they think that they can predict, right? So they tend to always predict economic growth, and in many cases, we don't have any economic growth. But in recent times, they have been predicting other things like pandemics, and we see where that might be the case, as in Event 2.1. But I shall not go there. We're looking at the problems. Well, that is a problem, I should say. Now, the fact of the matter is, when they went to Davos in 2017, the president of the then president of the United States, the former President Donald Trump, and his colleague, right? His rival, his economic rival, I should say, political rival, because that's what it's all about, the fact that China is the second largest economy in the world. So they were there and they had two different agendas. Trump was there to say that we have to change the world order, right? Because the economic world order that is, because America is not prospering under this world order, even though they're the ones who created the world order in the first place, the economic world order that is, right? But because of the military and these permanent wars, right? These never-ending wars, the United States is not winning economically, right? She is declining as fast as you can imagine, right? Because of her military spending, or overspending, I should say. Now, Xi Jinping, on the other hand, doesn't have that problem, right? He's not waging lots of wars around the world, right? Obviously, he's not China is not the superpower or the empire of the world. So they can use their monies a little bit more prudently and wisely in terms of developing their infrastructure and also using it to control other people's, land and resources, right? So both are economic empires, I should say, right? Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, China is also an economic empire. It's not an imperial um, power, but it is in terms of the economic realm, it is becoming, right? It is growing, it is burgeoning in its quest to become an economic imperial empire, imperial power, I should say, not imperial empire, but imperial power. Now, the fact of the matter is that, this is Donald Trump understood that, the China was flooding the United States with lots of things and, lots of exports. And the United States, on the other hand, was not doing the same, right? So if you have a country that is largely exporting and one that is only consuming, who do you think is going to be poorer, right? Definitely the one who is consuming, and the one who's exporting will be wealthier. And that is what is happening between China and the United States. But here's what Xi Jinping told his political rival, which is Donald Trump. We should not retreat into the harbor whenever we encounter a storm, or we will never reach the other shore. No one will emerge as a winner from a trade war. So therefore, Xi Jinping is saying that, leave the system alone, right? Because you see a storm and you don't like it might be wreaking destruction, but you should confront that storm, right? And ensure that you do not change guards, because it's working for China, right? The economic system is working for China. And this is how human beings can be very selfish. When things are working for us, we tend to go along with it, even though it might not be working for our neighbors, right? For our friends, for our colleagues, for our rivals. But once it's not working for us, then we begin to make a lot of noises, right? But should we be like that, or should we be principled in terms of whether it's working for us? But if we see that it's not working for someone else, then we should express some amount of consternation. But that's not how the human brain operates. That's, I should say, the sinful human brain operates. That doesn't operate that way. He or she thinks about him or herself. So Z here is saying it's working for us, Chinese, so why, for ourselves, why change the system of globalization, which was actually led by the US? Because as Edward Luce here says, after more than 70 years of US-led globalization, Xi's declaration of global stewardship in the spiritual home of capitalism was an Alice in Wonderland moment. Yet the switching rules, the changing of the global economy sentinel had been widely predicted, right? Set aside the most recent forecasts as far as back as 1902, when China's imperial ruins had long since been picked over by the European powers and the United States. The British historian John Hobson anticipated the day when a resurgent China would turn the tables. So here is what John Hobson is saying, and Edward Luce is describing it as prescience, right? Prescience. The fact that he's suggesting, what he suggested, he intimated in 1902 that China would have resurged as an economic, well, as an empire, as a global empire. China passing more quickly than other lower races through the period of dependence on Western science and Western capital, and quickly assimilating what they have to give, may re-establish her own economic independence, finding out of her own resources the capital and organizing skill required for machine industries. And he continues. So the essence of what he's saying, that China would eventually one day, that's John Hobson, the British historian, would definitely, and he said this in 1902, would resurge as an economic powerhouse, right? How dare him saying that, China would emerge among the, more so than members of the lower races, as if to suggest that the people in Europe and their so-called white race is the most superior. Nonsense. But that's what he says, and Edward Luce is actually acknowledging his prescience, right? And the fact that he was able to see that from 1902, right? Now, since the 1970s, and this is Luce saying, Asia's per capita income have increased fivefold, right? So that's it since the 1970s. So even in Africa, the world's worst performing continent, incomes have almost doubled, right? The West's median income, meanwhile, has barely shifted in the last half century, right? So the West is suffering while other countries, other non-Western countries are growing, right? In terms of their median incomes, right? We find that the median incomes in the West are diminishing. In some parts of Asia, such as Singapore and South Korea, incomes have either overtaken or are level pegging with the West, right? So what we're seeing now is that the West is not as wealthy economically as it used to be, because the golden years of the middle class growth were between the 1940s, right? 1946 to 1970 thereabout, right? Those were the years of the golden years of, you know, the blossoming, right? The prosper the economic prosperity of the middle classes in these Western societies, right? That situation or that prosperity ended thereabout in the 1970s, right? Particularly when the United States moved away from the gold standard, right? And I think that we can't lecture you on that, right? That happened in 1971 under President Nixon. Now, Edward Luce is saying here, by one recent historical measure, China and India in 1750 produced 3/4 of the world's manufacturers, right? On the eve of the First World War, their share had dropped to just 7.5%. Economic historians call it the age of divergence, right? So one of the things that you ought to understand, and Edward Luce pointed out in his book, is that when we think about China, we must understand that China was also an empire, right? And he said, according to Edward Luce, giving us the historical background, that between 1100, the years 1100 to 1800s, that's 7 centuries, China enjoyed, economic and enjoyed. It was the powerhouse of the world, right? Put it that way. It was at the height of its imperial quest, right, and domination, right? And that is for us to understand. So they're saying when the John Hobson, the historian, suggests that there is going to be a resurgence of China's imperial undertakings, right? Imperial power. He's suggesting that resurgence does not mean that it's coming up after the United States. It is being restored, right? Its imperial power is being restored. Now, based on what we have seen in history, no empires do not resurge, right? Once they're fallen, and they will not come back. You might see that there are attempts to do that. And European powers have done that. In Rome, for example, they tried. That's why they were intermarrying, and the cousins were with cousins, and probably brothers with brothers and sisters with sisters, right? Because they wanted to maintain that sort of European, blue blood line and all of that stuff. But, God says once he's the one who set them up and he puts them down. And when they are put down forever, right? They will not come back up. So even much fanfare about China becoming and resurging as world empire, that will never happen, right? Even when it appears that it's going to happen, it's never going to happen, right? We saw where the same thing was happening with in France under that great military guy. What's his name again? The military guy in France, Napoleon, right? Not Napoleon, the strong military guy. He was trying to reunite Europe. The same thing with the German guy, Hitler, all right? He was also trying to reunite Europe and to make Europe a powerhouse, another empire, right? Under the Roman Empire, but that didn't happen, right? It seemed like it was going to happen, right? If things had not changed, right? They would have been successful. But sometimes some little things happen in history which prevented them from achieving that purpose. First of all, the Haitian Revolution in Haiti, right? That alone was one of the major reasons for which Napoleon could not have won that war, right? God rose up some slaves, right, who without any powerful weapons, right, and with his help, they were able to defeat, right, the French, the Spanish, and the British. And all of these empires, by the way, that the Haitians defeated, and that's why Haiti is in the present situation that it's in, because all of these empires do not forget that Haiti actually decimated them and weakened significantly their empires. Because afterwards, as the great intellectual, Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James said, that the British was seriously weakened after the Haitian Revolution, right? They were just not the same anymore, because the British wanted that island also, because imagine if they had that island along with Jamaica, how much more money they would have generated from the proceeds of slavery. But that did not happen because the Haitians rose up and defeated all of these then three major empires. Now, we have to understand that the West is, is not doing well, and that there are other forces that want to also supplant the West as a global power. And, here Luce, that's Edward Luce, is intimating that the Chinese, who were humiliated for a century, right, want to gain back. They want to regain the power that they had to inflict some amount of vengeance, right, on the West. Let us say that, right? Because, he says it here succinctly, right? That's Edward Luce. And I quote, "From the Opium Wars of the 1840s until the 1949 Communist Revolution, China's century of humiliation still rankles, and in some respects, its historic resentment appears to be deepening. But the fact that the Industrial Revolution took place in Europe rather than in Asia played a more critical role in China's fall from grace than the often sordid tale of Western exploitation." Now, Edward Luce here is arguing, which I don't agree with him, in everything here that he says. He's saying that the Chinese humiliation did not just come from Western exploitation, but it came from the fact that the Western people had superior technologies. He also presented the fact that even in Africa, its decimation did not just come from Western exploitation and enslavement of its people. He did say that that was a moral crisis, that slavery was a moral issue and it should not have been. But he's saying that his argument is that the Westerners were so superior in their technology that even without that, that's what he's intimating, without the humiliation of China and without slavery, then Europe would have garnered lots of economic power, right? And profit. I don't think that that is true. They might have garnered some amount of the economic profit. We can't argue that, but certainly the amount that they were able to garner, I don't think they would have garnered outside without slavery and without the humiliation of China and what they did during the Opium War era, right? We have to understand that. Now, so we're seeing where these powers, the Chinese power and the United States, are at loggerhead, right? And even though the economic system is US-led, but China is using the US-led globalization strategy to defeat America, right? So it's using their own strategies and it's defeating them in their own game. Something that is really not sitting well with the American elites, right? And with American politicians. What is obviously conflicting to me is, are they that dumb, or is it that they're playing a game here? They're doing this intentionally. Because one would have thought that if you want to be the economic powerhouse, that you wouldn't have left your country, like the industries, the multinational industries or institutions, whatever you want to call them, that the Amazons and all these people who are in China, enriching China, right? So you have Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, among other large American factories and institutions, multinational institutions and organizations operating in China, right? So what do they think? Do they think that they're going to be enriching America by doing that, right? And, and not developing their own country? Something is not adding up, but that is the reality of the world. And I leave you to think about that, right? So we're seeing where China and India and places like Thailand, right, Indonesia are really now occupying, great threats to American middle class, where these nations, what happened? You have the United States moving its factories into these countries, and their middle classes are growing, right? Remember now that when China, became a part of the WTO, right? That's the World Trade Organization. They weren't yet as very wealthy as Americans, right? Or they weren't any significant economic power at the time. But guess who brought China into the World Trade Organization? Your favorite president, your boy, right? Bill Clinton, right? That guy, wonderful, dynamic Bill Clinton, brought China into the World Trade Center. Now, here's what Bill Clinton said about globalization. Bill Clinton, the then, and this is now Edward Luce in his book, quoting from Bill Clinton, Slick Willie. Bill Clinton, and I quote, the then US president said that globalization was the economic equivalent of a force of nature. Stress means that it was inevitable, right? Like wind or water. Right? This is Bill Clinton speaking that globalization is necessary. I forgot the word that Chalmers Johnson used in his book. Indispensable, right? So they would use these words like indispensable. These are the terminologies that sometimes they use, that we can't live without globalization in their form, which is this free trade economic model that they are suggesting, right? But the world's lived with it before. We had our national borders and we were surviving, weren't we? And in fact, Chalmers Johnson argued in chapter 9 of his book, Sorrows of Empire, that the growth in these national countries were very much better and more elevated than what we're experiencing now. And after globalization, particularly after the 1990s, 70s, and onward, we can see that our economies have been going down, right? And more people are impoverished, and hence we're seeing lots of people moving to what they deem to be more prosperous countries, right? The immigration, by the way, is not happening rather out of thin air. It's happening because some people are being displaced in their countries, and it is intentional, right? It is intentional. Hope you understand that. So let's continue with what Edward Luce is saying. In addition, he argued that Clinton's entry would reduce America's bilateral trade deficit by binding China to lower tariff rates on its imports. So he thought that that America's bilateral deficit would be reduced, right? And that did not work. Following China's WTO accession in 2001, America's trade deficit with China has leapt almost fivefold, right? So, I'm not going to blame Bill Clinton, because I'm sure Bill Clinton spoke with his economic experts, right? These guys from Harvard University and from Princeton and the Yales, right? I am sure that he spoke with them, and they told him that it would have been reduced significantly, right? That's the bilateral trade deficit. But it has augmented, as Luce is suggesting here, fivefold, right? It is clear in retrospect that Beijing had a better grasp of the global economies dynamics than Washington does. I don't think so, right? I don't think so. I think that this was done deliberately, intentionally. I do not think that, Americans were that daft to think that, including China in the World Trade Organization, would have seriously put a dent to their bilateral trade deficit? I don't think so. I can't share that. I'm sorry. Now, what we have to understand, when we talk about economic growth, this is something I think he is here mentioning. And we have to be careful what we say about that and who is the growth for, right? Now, in today's world, most cross-border trade, this is Edward Luce speaking, is intra-company movement of unfinished goods. So Apple iPhone is produced in 9 different countries. Since the goal is to capture Western technology, it makes no sense for developing countries to slap tariffs on imports, which are as likely to be intermediate goods, moving from one part of the supply chain to the next, right? Now, what we see happening is that as they are having these companies, operating in many different countries around the world, you find that people are losing their jobs, right? Factories are moving to where they find work more profitable, right? And you find that people are now being alienated, right? So all dread the wrath of an alienated Western middle class, because the people who used to work in these factories were part of the middle class, whether they want to accept it or not. They were earning good salaries, right? When they were at the time, probably 1990s and before, they were earning perhaps $20 per hour, which at the time was good money, right? And they could buy their cars and their houses and send their children to school and feed their families. I think that they were also a part, not I think, they were a part of that middle class, right? So if those people have lost their jobs, then you would see a dwindling of that middle class, a significant dwindling, reduction of that middle class. And these people are going to become alienated and angry, right? Because they're angry for a justifiable reason, right? They're seeing where their jobs are being siphoned off to these different countries, which are, in some cases like China, are called their enemies or their political rivals, right? And yet still, they are being impoverished and nobody's listening. People are saying it's globalization. And as Bill Clinton says, it is inevitable and it is like force of nature. It's like the wind, right? Or the air, something that you must live by. If you're not going to embrace globalization, then you might as well die, right? Because talk about the wind and the air, right? Without the air, without oxygen, you cannot survive. And Bill Clinton is here saying that globalization, this free trade economic model, this neoliberal model, which is not free in any sense of the word, by any stretch of the imagination, right? But that is what your boy has said, right? Lovely President Bill Clinton. Now, it is very important that we understand that, the whole Washington consensus, what's his name, Edward Luce is suggesting, is very, very important we understand. He talks about the fact that that the China will continue to make big strides on the West in the coming decades in terms of purchasing power parity, measured by what you can buy in the local currency. China's economy surpassed the United States in 2014, right? So that is in terms of the purchasing power parity, right? And purchasing power parity means what people can buy in the local currency, right? So that's what you need to understand. And he's suggesting that China has surpassed the United States in 2014 as a major economic power. Now, that is something that is debatable and something, he's not suggesting here that, all Chinese people, because he does recognize that China is still a developing country, but is one of the fastest, is the fastest developing country in the world, right? Now, the economists are, are expecting that by 2050, a century after its communist revolution, China's economy is likely to be twice the size of America's and larger than all the Western economies combined. I'm going to repeat that. By 2050, a century after its communist revolution, that's Chinese communist revolution, China's economy is likely to be twice the size of America's and larger than all the Western economies combined, right? So this is the whole situation. So a century of restoration will have followed a century of humiliation. That is a century of restoration of the Chinese being restored to economic powerhouse, to becoming an empire, will be followed by a century of humiliation, right? When they were humiliated by the Western powers through the opium wars and also the communist revolution. Now, Luce is here saying whether the Western way of life and our liberal democratic systems can survive this dramatic shift of global power is the question of this book. Now, listen to what he's saying here. The answer is not entirely in our hands, but our response so far has been to accelerate the shift. Donald Trump's victory, which was in 2016, by the way, crystallizes the West's failure to come to terms with the reality it faces, right? So the people and Donald Trump, that Donald Trump's followers, when I say the people, I mean Donald Trump's followers, the MAGA group, they understand the reality, right? They might not be expressing it in the most refined, scholastic way, scholarly way, whatever you want to say, right? But they certainly understand the realities and they are expressing themselves. And in a democratic society, they have that right to express their concerns. Once they're not burning down bridges and creating any sort of mayhem, they have all right, to express their concerns, right, and their anger with the system that we have currently in place. So this is what he said. There are no answers. The fact of the matter is that the politicians know that there are no answers. They know that there are no answers. And if there are answers, the answers would be that the whole system will have to be revamped, will have to be overhauled, right? And if the system is overhauled and revamped, a lot of people will go down, a lot of heads will roll, right? And they will lose a lot of their profits and lots of their monies. That's what happened during slavery, by the way, right? If you read the history of slavery in the United States particularly, and among other countries too, but let us remain in the United States here, where slavery took a long time to go down. Right, it was until the 1860s, somewhere, after the mid 19th century, while it had gone down in most of the countries in the Americas, except Brazil and Cuba, the United States still had slavery, right? Still practiced slavery. The country of the bold and the brave, right? Still practiced slavery until then, until the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we learned that many of these people, these elites, right? These economic elites, these slave overlords, the masters, killed themselves. They committed suicide. They just could not live in the system that was overhauled, right? They just could not envision themselves living in that system where their so-called slaves would be equal with them, and they would have lost significant portions of their revenues, right? They were not willing to accept that. And the global elites now, those billionaires, are not going to be willing to accept if we revamp a system and allow them to lose significant portions of their revenues. That is not going to happen. But Edward Luce is saying here that the Washington consensus has died. It is no longer working, right? He says that in 2008, during the global financial crisis, the Washington consensus died, right? The same consensus that Jamaica took up in 2009 thereabout, and it has continued and is now, and you can go back and listen to my video yesterday. I said that Jamaica is the favorite pupil of the IMF, right? Because the IMF is a part of the Washington consensus, right? And so here, Luce is saying the Washington consensus prescribed open trading systems, free movements of capital, and central bank monetary discipline. Countries that swallowed that prescription suffered terribly during the 1995 Mexican to Sabana crisis, the 1997 Asian food crisis, and in Russia, Brazil, and elsewhere during the later 1990s. Right? All of these countries suffered under the Washington Consensus, right? It's not a system that works, right? It's a system that impoverishes these countries, and people know that, right? I don't know why Jamaica has not yet learned that lesson, right? Or is it that it is forced not to learn that lesson? Now, we understand based on what Edward is saying that China, on the other hand, did not accept the Washington Consensus, and that's why they've grown, right? China decides that it's going to do what it deems best for its people and for the country. Right? Listen to what Edward Luce is saying here. He's saying most of the world has since chosen China's more pragmatic path of opening slowly and on its own terms, right? China's unorthodox route to develop exposed the limits of the Washington Consensus, right? So China did not just do what they tell her to do, right? She did that with great caution. Whatever they told her to do, she looked carefully to see if that would work for the people and for her development, right? But the other countries, such as Jamaica and other countries in Latin America, they have to do and move with alacrity when Washington tells them to do so, right? But China doesn't do that, and as a result of that, it was able to grow. So, Edward Luce is playing tongue in cheek now. He's saying that he thinks that other countries, some of these developing countries are, now following, in the they are adopting the Beijing consensus, right? The Beijing consensus of opening up slowly and doing that which is best for your country's development. Now, Edward Luce makes a very important point here, and I underline it because very, very important point. Because Lord Lev told you that we're living in a delusional world, particularly in the West, right? And he says here, and I quote from Edward Luce, as is so often the case, our ways of thinking about the world lag behind reality. Now, do you know why he says this in the context of what we talked about in 2008 as a global financial crisis? And here, Edward Luce is challenging that there was no global financial crisis. What you had was an Atlantic recession, right? Right? Because he says that while we were having the global financial, what we considered to have been the global financial crisis in 2008, right? The economy of China grew by, guess how much? 10%, right? It grew by almost 10% of the Chinese economy. So how could they be happy? They weren't suffering from a recession, right? We were suffering from a recession in the West, but China wasn't suffering from a recession in 2008. In 2008 also, he says that India grew by almost 8%, right? So our understanding of the world is what we hear from the media and from these so-called academic elites, what you go to university and you study. And the professors tend not to be living in the real world, right? I was having a conversation with one of my friends yesterday or day before yesterday, and we acknowledge that a lot of what we, it's just we're not in the real world when we talk about academics, and people who say they're academics, right, don't understand the world in which they live, right? Because we just go and our heads are so deeply planted into textbooks that we do not really try to align ourselves with the socioeconomic realities of the world that exist in the world, right? And whilst you're reading a book, and I do that from time to time, try sometimes to get up after you've read maybe some paragraphs, particularly those that have very heavy material, very heavy content to reflect on. Just walk around and think about what the author is trying to articulate and trying to communicate, because oftentimes we tend not to do that. We need to do more reflection. Now, when we think about economic growth, as Robert H., and he's quoting Robert H. Frank, the Cornell economist, points out, on average, we have about 1.9 legs each, because some people have only one leg. Likewise, look at what he's talking about. Look at what Edward was saying. Likewise, if Mark Zuckerberg joins your neighborhood football team, every member is on average a billionaire. And that's what happens to these economic growth, these spurious economic growth theory or theoretical frameworks. So you have a number of investors who go to Jamaica or go to wherever they go to China, to Indonesia, and you think because at the end of the day, they say there is this economic growth. Yeah, because they're looking at the aggregate economic growth. But, after that is done, then all the money is going to leave, right? All these hot money that you get in the economy leave, and they go back to their tax havens, right? Whether in the Caribbean or wherever in the world. Listen to what Edward Luce is saying, and this is very important that you understand this in light of what we now describe as economic growth, because there's this new model of economic growth. But listen to what Edward Luce is saying here. Very, very important that you understand this concept. Under the old model, and this is what he's suggesting, Edward Luce, where most production was clustered behind national barriers, what was good for General Motors was good for America. So when we had national sovereignties and we didn't have all of these, globalization, laws and rules and regulations, then all of the growth was walled, right, behind national barriers. Now, the annual gross domestic product figure meant as much as to GM's American customers as it did to their company. If the US economy grew by 5%, there was a high chance the automaker's bottom line had expanded by a similar amount. America's median income growth rose in line with GDP. Much the same could have been said of Britain's ICJ or Rolls-Royce, right? So, but this is what he's now saying. Since 2009, the US economy has expanded by roughly 2% a year. Yet, it took until 2015 for the median income to regain the level it enjoyed before the Great Recession. It took so many years for it to get back to that level, just to get to the median income that it was enjoying before the Great Recession. That is unbelievable, right? Listen to what he's saying here to some of us, because we need to understand that these are the problems, and that's why we have Donald Trump and his people are extremely angry with what they see is happening in the United States and in the Western world at large, right? What is happening in the United States is not only United States reality, it's the reality in the West, and that's why we also had the Brexit in England, right? Because the people want to say this thing is not working for us, right? Because they're talking about all these international laws and climate change and everything. And what about us? We seem not to be involved in these discussions, and basic needs are not being mentioned. Today, the US, that's Edward Luce now saying, these are his words. Today, the US median income is still below where it was at the beginning of the century. Right? It is below where it was at the beginning of this century. Right? This is incredible. So you're saying that people were richer in the United States at the beginning of the century. And one would have thought that the purpose of having a capitalist society and a progressive society is that each successive generation will get richer. But what is happening here is that people are getting poorer. Right? Clearly, what the typical American understands by growth differs greatly from that of economists. Right? So when you talk about the economics, it doesn't make any sense. right? Because it's only for the rich, right? Not for the poor, as he's suggesting here. Bill Gates goes and join a team, right? Or goes to a neighborhood, then everybody on that team is a billionaire. It doesn't make any sense because the reality is that all of them will never be a billionaire. GDP numbers insist we are doing well at a time when half the country is suffering from personal recessions. So it's the people that you have to go and speak to understand. When you're doing these quantitative analyses, right, you've got to also do your qualitative studies by going to do interviews and stuff like that, right, to see what people are facing, their struggles in the economies of the world. You can't listen to what the central banks are saying, because a lot of time they're saying bogus, mumbo jumbo, they're speaking mumbo jumbo, nothing of any worth. Now, Edward Luce continues, and this is very important. Remember now that we're looking at the problems that are bedeviling Western societies, right? Particularly the United States, because this is where we're having it is, deemed to be the exemplar of democracies, right? And is it? Is it really the example of democracies around the world? The asset value of the world's leading billionaires has risen fivefold since 1988, right? The asset values have risen fivefold since 1988. So this has not been just happening yesterday. This has been an ongoing trend, right? And we need to understand that. In fact, there was uh, a rebuilding of the economic infrastructure in the 1970s, right? And that is why, you had people like the Michael Manley's and other people in Latin America who spoke out against the system. But it was a US-led system in which the United States sought to dominate the world. But now it's find that it's coming back to haunt her. These same strategies that she used, other nations, other enemies are using them or have used them and continue to use them, and some are winning. Now, remember that this world is survival of the fittest, right? So if you can take something and run with it and, win it, and yeah, so much power to you. It's not a system that is built on principles, right? And that's why you can't follow everything that the IMF tells you to do or the World Bank tells you to do, as countries like Jamaica does. You have to ask them and tell them that this does not work for my country. It might work for Mexico, but it's not going to work for Jamaica, right? But these people think that, yeah, everything, one hat fits all, right? Now, what one could do with all the money is a parlor game we all enjoy. And he begins to talk about the fact that the billionaires, right, and the elites, the global elites and the local elites have been enriching themselves at the expense of the local populace. So this is what is causing the sort of anger, right, amongst people like in the Trump base. And if the truth be told, it's not only in Trump base, not among the MAGA people. The Democrats are also estranged from the system. They only don't want to be called Trumpian, right? They don't want to be associated with the Trump group. So they decide, oh, yeah, we're still Democrats and we're independents, or we're undecided. But you have to decide, because whether or not you like it, these factors, right, are going to affect you, right? So you must decide where you want to be. It's almost like Peter, right? When Peter, Christ had told him that, you're going to deny me, right? The cock will not crow, twice before you deny me thrice. And the fact of the matter is that Peter eventually denied him, but Peter didn't want to associate himself with Christ when he saw Christ in his humiliation, right? And the fact that Christ did not, liberate himself from the Romans, right? So sometimes people tend to be shy. They don't want to associate with people, whom they think is not so refined and scholastic, even though Christ was superior, but the fact of the matter, when he was going through struggles, the disciples, particularly Peter at the time, thought that he just did not want to associate with that man, So I never knew that man, interesting. But, thankfully, Peter was converted, right? We need to be converted to the truth, right? And here I'm not speaking in religious realm. We need to be converted to the economic and sociopolitical truth of our times. And many of us have not yet been converted, right? We just remain on the periphery, just looking, just looking, right? And thinking that miracles are going to happen very soon, all right? It's not going to happen. Now, Edward Luce is saying here, to be clear, the West's soaring mood, which means that people are angry, is about the psychology of dashed expectations rather than the decline in material comforts. Now, listen to what he's saying here. A few years ago, a New Yorker cartoon caught the essence of what we feel about things. So this is a New York cartoon, New Yorker, the newspaper, cartoon. It's not real, but this expresses the sentiments shared by many people. It showed a Chinese mother finger wagging at her daughter's uneaten dinner. This is what the mother is telling to her Chinese daughter. Eat your rice, Han Ling. Don't you know there are children in West Virginia who are starving? Now, this is not happening yet, right? But what the point he's making here, because he does acknowledge afterwards that the West per capita income is superior to that of China and many of these countries. But he's saying that there is a fast pace to put a dent in that sort of per capita income, that China is going to be very, very, to be a society to be reckoned with, right, in the coming years or decades, right? So Americans have to take stock that very soon you are going to lose your purchasing power and the economic wealth that you have. Because, sometimes in the 1960s, one of my American friends told me that that's what they were told by their parents, that they should not waste because people in China are starving. But here we see the New Yorker now saying, through its cartoon, that, the American, the Chinese lady is saying to her daughter that she should eat up her food in China because there are people in West Virginia who are starving. And that might be a reality very soon, right? Be careful of what you see is happening in the world. Edward Luce mentions a point here where he says that when people lose faith in the future, they are less likely to invest in the present, right? So I think that lots of Americans are losing faith in the future, right? They don't see a viable future in the United States, right? So we need to take stock and realize that, he talks about the whole matter of the opioid epidemic. Remember, they had also the opium also in China, and you really wonder if that is what is happening in the Western world when they actually drugged out the population of the West, that is, drugged out the population of China during the opium wars. And now we're seeing here where we have an opioid crisis in America, right? So are Americans being humiliated? I'm not saying that they are, but you need to ask yourself that question. Now, here what he's saying, deaths from drug overdoses have tripled since 2000. America's opioid heroin epidemic now rivals HIV/AIDS at its peak. Some of the deaths are accidental, some deliberate. You can choose your culprit. Heroin comes from Mexico, painkillers come from your family doctor, right? Some of you trust your family doctors so much that you think that they mean you well, and sometimes they don't. And it's all about money. I don't know if they mean you well or not. Sometimes it just boils down to money and profit. And if they can make some more bucks, particularly with those people who have to pay high student loans, right? They are not going to complain, even though it might be doing harm. So be careful, make sure you do your own research before you take any sort of medicines. Now, that is my warning to you. America's incidence of acute pain has not tripled since the late 1990s. This is what now Edward Luce continues to say in his book. Yet the volume of painkiller prescriptions has. Sales of OxyContin, the strongest opioid on the market, shot up from $45 million in 1995 to $3.1 billion in 2015. Wow, that is also incredible, right? Here is what Edward Luce begins to say, continues rather to say that trust is a serious crisis that we're facing. And when there's no trust in any relationship, we know that it is not going to work. He says here, when social trust falls, the cost of doing business rises. Even in the late 18th century, at the dawn of modern growth, Smith grasped the psychological importance of possessing faith, in a better future, right? So we have lost faith in a system. And when we lose faith in our system, it means, therefore, that the cost of doing business is going to rise, right? So one of the things is that we are seeing a decline in America, in the West, in Western prosperity. And we've got to take stock, right? History tells us that's Edward Luce speaking again. History tells us that inequality soars when societies develop, right? And we saw that after the Civil War, the US Civil War, that is, and the rise of the robber barons and the industries, right? Industries started to proliferate in America, the railroads, right? The shipping lines, the iron and steel mills and machine industries. And as these industries started to grow, and America became, very prosperous economically after slavery, after the US slavery, we could see that there was also a great divide between the rich and the poor. And that's why we had in the early 1900s under Roosevelt, right? That was Teddy Roosevelt. We had Theodore Roosevelt, that is. We had these monopoly laws, right? That were the antitrust laws that were put into place because these guys were really, really some thieves, right? The Carnegies and the other ones that the other American robber barons, right? They really took a great portion of the wealth and wanted to control every aspect of American society. So we have to take stock. We can see now that we are hearing that our societies are getting richer, but we can see that there is a great divide, right, between the rich and the poor. Now, I can't go through all of what this guy has with this chapter. It's a lot of problems that we are facing. And I think I have highlighted enough. We need to read this book, and I will repeat it. It's Edward Luce, and he is the author of Time to Start Thinking, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Now, this is what Lawrence Summers has to say about the book. Edward Luce provides a terrifying view of the challenges facing the West. We have to hope that his prophecies are self-denying, something that is more likely if his penetrating analysis gets the wide attention it richly deserves. Now, this is what Lawrence Summers is saying about the book. Now, he went into all of the, fact of the matter that our cities have become, oceans of resentment. He said that they're paradise, they're like tropical paradises surrounded by oceans of resentment, right? Where people see all of this wealth and high-rise buildings, right? And we think, we're moving on, we are advancing, we're progressing. But in those cities, people can hardly live. How do you rent an apartment that is going in the US, for example, that is for $3,000 per month, $2,500 per month, right? People are now are barely surviving and to pay their bills and other expenses that they have, right? It's very, very difficult, right? But you see all of these wonderful, apartments, right? With all modern amenities going up. And people think that somehow the economy is growing, and yes, one day their future is going to be um, great, right? But that is not the case, right? Because our people tend to think superficially. People tend not to want to engage themselves with serious knowledge and with serious learning. I was just trying to find if I could see something here that I might have left out. Um, Now, let me read something here that he has. Danny Roderick, and this is something I should definitely not want to leave out of this conversation. Danny Roderick, one of the world's leading international economists, talks of the global trilemma, not dilemma, but trilemma. He says here, we cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national determination, and economic globalization. I want to repeat this, right? Because this is an interesting quotation and point that this guy is raising. We cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national determination, and economic globalization. They cannot operate in the same. They cannot operate in the same room. And that's exactly what we're doing. So whilst some people are calling for globalization and saying like Bill Clinton, that it is a force of nature, something that we cannot avoid because it is a force of nature, like the wind and the air, right? That's what Bill Clinton said. But they're, again, they're telling us that we are sovereign and that we are, while laws are being made, right, that supplant our national laws, right? We're told that we're independent and we're sovereign, and every year we celebrate independence. At the same time, globalization and its rules, right, often supplant national laws and rules, right? That is what we need to understand, and I don't think we understand that yet. Edward Luce says here, the space for national democracy is shrinking, right? Vast areas that were once the preserve of national sovereignty are now ring-fenced by international law and global regulation, right? This is what is happening. And this is why you see these guys now in Davos, these wealthy millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires converged in Switzerland. They're at Davos, right? And they are making decisions for you and for me, right? And irrespective of the national laws that might mitigate against these international laws. Because, we need to understand that these guys don't mean you well, right? Their major quest is to gain profit and profit over people. And you must understand that, right? And the fact of the matter is that these guys control the politicians who represent you or who should be representing, right? But because of their greed because of the politicians' greed, right, they accept anything that is told to them. And they're also, what do you call them, these guys again? These are, entertainers, the politicians are entertainers. They're celebrities. That's the word I was using, right? All politicians are celebrities. I saw Andrew Holness the other day. They were premiering a video on Bob Marley, for Bob Marley. It was something about One Love video for Valentine's Day. So you had these major actors and actresses in Jamaica, as they were making the film. And I saw your boy, Andrew Holness, and his wife. And just, I couldn't recognize Juliet. She was so much decked in what you call it now. This in lots of um what do they call the thing that these people put on their faces? Right. I could not recognize her face at all. The fact of the matter is, the world's elites have helped to provoke what they feared, a populist uprising against the world economy. Globalization, this is now what Edward Luce is saying. Very, very important point he's raising here. And I want to repeat it so that you can digest it. The world's elites have helped to provoke what they feared, a populist uprising against the world economy. Globalization is going into reverse, just as impact of new technology is showing signs of picking up. In his Harvard class, Roderick offers students a choice. Should we globalize democracy or restrict it at home? We've got to decide. And how do we globalize democracy? That is a question that he also should be posing. How can we globalize democracy? Because that looks to be like a totalitarian form of democracy. Because the world is different. We have different religions, we have different political systems, right? So this Harvard professor needs also to ask that question. How do we globalize democracy, right? Students always vote strongly for global democracy. That's what Edward is saying, because they don't understand, right? They're rich and they couldn't care less. But if it does not work at the European level, what chance would it stand worldwide? Very good, right? This is an excellent point. I didn't even think about that at the European, Union level, it's not working because the British and the Italians and the Germans and the French are not the same people. We just like to clump them and say, oh, they're white people. They're not the same. They're national people. They have different cultures. They have different ideologies. They have different religions, right? And they don't get along. And that is why we had the world wars. And even for World War I and World War II, during slavery, they fought, right? There probably wasn't a year where they were not fighting against each other, right? So to talk about these white people, white what? What does white mean? Right? The same thing like on the African continent, they're also all not the same. And they have different cultures, they have different religions, they have different worldviews, right? And in the Caribbean, these are the islands that you think are all the same. We are also not all the same, right? We have different worldviews. Jamaica and Trinidad are totally different countries, right? We share some values, but culturally we are different, right? The demographic is different, right? We need to understand this. The CARICOM is not going to work also because we just don't see eye to eye. We pretend that it's working, but it's not working. We're only wasting money, monies that we could have diverted or put into other important sectors and infrastructures. The other choice, as he's suggesting, either we have global democracy or this is the other choice that Edward Luce is advancing, right? The other choice, autocracy, is a bleak prospect, though a disturbingly broad range of nations are edging towards it. We're edging towards autocracy. We are edging towards autocracy. AUTOCRACY. We are edging toward autocracy, right? That is the agenda, right? Whether you like it or not. Which leaves us with one practical alternative, abandoning the drive to deep globalization. Roderick calls this thin globalization, right? My friends, globalization has not worked. It has ravaged the global economy. It also has supplanted our national sovereignty. It has made people believe that they have no worth. And the fact that, some rich guys want cheap laborers, that they should allow all these people to come to their countries and accept the jobs are very cheap, or they have to pay cheap, they are paying cheap wages. And then you're not competent enough, and that's why you're not working. Or this is a globalized world, one trying to find a job. There are jobs in the manufacturing industry, even though there's not a manufacturing sector, right? Or the schools are just not equipping its graduates with the technical skills for modern information world, right? It's just not information age, right? It's an information age. And our students are not being equipped with the skills that they need to adapt in this information age, right? Nonsense. Utter nonsense that these guys are articulating. But we believe them. And so it is effective propaganda. But it works. And if it works, why not use it? Because that is the purpose of communication, of effective communication. In fact, it might be effective, it might not be truthful, but it is effective, right? And people are living now where they've lost their self-esteem, they've lost their identity, they've lost their cultures, and they're just there, wondering what to do next. That is why Donald Trump and other people that are other politicians that are there to fill this void, that is why they're there. Because at least they might not be genuine, as I'm suggesting here, but at least they listen. And when people are disturbed, whether or not you're genuine, they want an heir or heirs to listen. They want all heirs. That is what they want. And our politicians have not been listening to our citizens, particularly in the Western world, as they're suffering. They're suffering. What they do, they fill them up with entertainments on YouTube, on cables, at the movie theaters. And people just tend to move along, and they drug you. When they can't control you, they just give you pain medicines, painkillers. Go take a few pills. Go take your medicine, and you'll be fine. Is that the society you want to live in? I don't. That's not the society that I would like to live in. But I'm living in that society, but that's not the world that I would like to plunge myself. Thank you for listening to one of my rants, right? I hope to see you in the next video. Have a fantastic